You know, it's easy to see what wildfires do to Idaho's landscape. The ash, the torched trees, the blackened hillsides, but sometimes they also highlight what is lying just below the surface. And that would be the debate over who should manage Idaho's land. Could the state do a better job than the feds? Well, that depends on how much Idaho taxpayers want to spend, because fighting fires and then rehabbing the land, it's not cheap. It's a concept that is still fresh on the ground and in the minds of those who lived through one of Idaho's biggest summer wildfires last year. Hunter Funk takes us to Redfish Lake, where a spark, a crash, and a massive response left lessons Idaho can't afford to ignore.
You just heard from stakeholders about how difficult it would be to manage state and federal lands within our borders. But what does this specifically mean when it comes to wildfires and fire mitigation? We drove more than 100 miles away from here over to Stanley and looked back at the 2024 wildfire season. How was it handled? What did they learn? And what would this look like if it was in the state's hands to handle it?
Last year on a beautiful day, July 12th, all of a sudden a puff of smoke came up across the lake here at the Bench Lakes.
For Redfish Lake Lodge owners Jeff and Audra Clegg,
It just started to escalate, and there was a helicopter crew that came in. The helicopter unfortunately crashed in the lake, and they had to kind of revamp. And the next day, the Forest Service, because of what was going on, contacted us and said we need to evacuate everybody. So we spent the better part of the day trying to get all the guests off the lake, off the beach.
What unfolded for the next 16 days during their busiest season changed everything. They had to relocate about 100 employees.
It became a really dramatic event. There was just 3 or 4 of us in here, and then all the Forest Service firefighting crew came in.
Fire crews poured in across the west, bringing planes, sprinklers, pumps, and started backburning, giving everything they had to protect the lodge and stop the fire.
Congressman Simpson pulled Audra and I aside and said to us, if we lose Redfish Lake Lodge, it's not because we didn't give it everything we have. And they did. I mean, they literally unleashed all of their facilities.
We felt protected.
Yeah.
We really did feel protected.
But behind this fire line was federal crews, federal dollars, and federal laws. And hypothetically, if these lands were to be handed over to the state, people like Justin Hayes with the Idaho Conservation League say it would come with a price tag that the state isn't ready for.
The state could just never take over that responsibility. If somehow these lands became state lands, the firefighting bill would be about $150 million a year that the state would have to cough up.
Hayes says that would likely come back to the taxpayers.
Communities across Idaho are annually passing levies and bonds trying to pay for the school system around them. What do you think, you're going to have like a levy and a bond to support what was once the national forest but is now a state? No, it's just not going to happen.
He says that dollar figure doesn't even include the cost of fire mitigation. Things like prescribed burns, forest thinning, and building fire breaks to protect communities before a fire starts.
There's a lot of demands put on it, and so it's a lot harder to manage. And the state management framework's just very different. It's much more, we're here to make money, we're doing this one thing. They're not balancing as many competing demands.
Fire mitigation comes with a lot of red tape. Jeff Beeler spent years defending federal agencies in court.
Throughout the West, we've seen some of the most severe fires we've ever experienced.
When you look at the time before a fire starts, Beeler says even small projects like thinning trees require layers of environmental review that slow it down.
The federal government, in order to approve that project, would have to go through a process under the National Environmental Policy Act. It just sort of requires agencies to engage in well-informed decision-making. They have to notify the public, they have to explain the scope of the project, allow for public commentary, and then they need to make sure that they're engaging in sort of the environmental analysis that they need to conduct. It's not easy for the federal government to comply with these statutes. There are regulations that are involved. I mean, it takes time for that to occur.
He says it can take years, even after a priority location is established, to begin the project. And no matter if it's the state or federal government, they have to go through that procedure, and many end up in a court battle from environmental groups, adding to the cost.
It would require a level of investment and a level of management that the state thus far, has not done, right? We've relied primarily on the federal government because it's federal government land. It would be difficult if all of the land were given to the state of Idaho, for example.
Designated wilderness areas are even more difficult to get an approved fire mitigation plan. It's an effort he says the federal government takes seriously.
If the forest is not being managed, trees are not being cut down, and there are these massive wildfires, lives could be lost, firefighters could be killed. I mean, there are a number of consequences for that.
Work that Hayes believes the state of Idaho wouldn't want to take on for the added responsibility and cost.
The state of Idaho has a track record of selling lots of land. I mean, 41%, 42% of all the land they've ever owned, they've already sold into private hands. And so if somehow they became the landlords, the owners of the Boise National Forest, they couldn't afford to manage it. And so they would find the parts that they wanted to manage for timber production, and they would sell off the parts that they didn't think were economical to them.
For Redfish Lake lodge owners, it all comes back to gratitude for the amount of help that stepped in.
We felt a lot of support from the firefighters and the Forest Service during all of that. The communications were excellent. We were, informed all along the way. We attended all the community meetings. And they did an outstanding job of protecting all of our facilities.
And it's the reason they can continue running the iconic lodge today.
We're just so grateful. Everything is here and everything is good.
Yeah.
We're so grateful.
Well, coming up tomorrow, we have the final installment of our Public Lands special, Beyond Growth. How do cities grow when the land next door is off limits for development? Because, well, obviously it's owned by the government. Or how do they expand? We're headed to Stanley to learn more about that. And if you missed any of these stories in this series this week, or just want to watch tomorrow's segment right now, you can watch the entire special on KTVB+.